So, we talked in our first lesson about Paris's World Expo and about the amazing job that the French did and the incredible success that they had as far as the Eiffel Tower was truly just something beyond comprehension for people and how it really sort of like put to shame what America had. So let's look back at a second at exactly what did America have. Well, again, Thomas Edison was at the fair and he brought his amazing new invention, the phonograph or the gramophone, the the device that would record sound and play it back. And it truly was an amazing thing. But part of the problem was it wasn't it was sort of more the overall effect of what America had. So this was America's place at the fair. Now, notice you really can't see any of the rest of the World's Fair like anywhere. Here's the River Seine. The World's Fair is like way down that way. Here's the American Pavilion. And look, it's just like tent cities everywhere. Why? Because this is the main attraction that America brought to the fair. Buffalo Bill's Wild West extravaganza, where you would go and see several different shows a day, this cowboys, Indians, stagecoach robberies, Mexican banditos, shoot 'em up, bang bang, all in a giant field of mud. When you got done watching that, the main attraction of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was Annie Oakley, Little Sure Shot, the pretty girl with the gun. That's right. In America, even the women were savages and had guns. Put a blindfold on Annie, she'll shoot stuff. Throw something in the air, Annie will shoot it. Spin Annie in a circle, she'll shoot when she gets done. Heck, she'll shoot while she's spinning in the circle. You spin in a circle and Annie will shoot. She was a trick shot. But what this whole thing did was sort of reinforce the idea that America was a land of backwoods savages and barbarians, where even the women were savages, even the civilized women were savages. America had put no thought or planning into what it was going to do for the fair. It had gotten used to the idea at the previous World's Fairs, starting with Philadelphia and then followed by London and Vienna and Sydney, that all America had to do was show up with our latest cool Edison toy. And it was like, oh my gosh, those Americans are so incredible. Good grief. Can't believe what the Americans made this time. Oh, did you see that thing? Whoa, look at that amazing thing right there. Okay, no. As much as that was, it compales in comparison to the Eiffel Tower. And when all was said and done with the 1889 World Expo, when it wrapped up at the end of the year, it proved what France wanted to show. Nothing would ever compare to it again because Philadelphia had been the be all and end all. But the French one was bigger. It was larger in space. Its main building, the Palace of Machinery, was bigger than America's Hall of Machines. Attendance wise, Philadelphia had gotten 26 million people. Paris had planned for 28 million. Paris got 35 million. And in one day, Paris had almost a million people. Profit. Pretty much since the 1860s, every World's Fair had lost money, but the Paris World Expo turned a profit. Now, to be fair about this, Paris's profit after 6 months of putting on this giant expo and 35 million people showing up, Paris's overall profit was around $50,000 American. If the World Expo had been a movie, it would be considered an utter failure at that rate of return. Displays, oh man, the Paris had it all. It had technology, it had art, it had French food, it had French people. It also featured all the new stuff from all of the other countries and a really weird thing known as the human zoo, where you would walk through it and there would be people from African or Asian regions or maybe even Polynesian areas in cages with little houses like that represented where they were from, and you looked at them like some kind of animal. It was really horrible and degrading. The people who were doing it realized it was horrible and degrading, but that's kind of what they were getting paid to do. So it really was very patronizing. No European country wanted to try to compete. And this made it really easy when the United States petitioned the World's Fair Commission to award the next World's Fair again to America. And it was largely due to the fact that America was embarrassed and humiliated. We wanted to show that we were, darn it, if the French think they can do better than us, they are sadly mistaken. We won up to the world before, we'll one them up again. So, the United States is awarded the right to host the 1892 World's Fair to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's landing in America. Now, understand again, Congress is like, yes, let's do this World's Fair. Yes, let's show everybody that we're better. Yes, let's show what America can do. We are Americans. We're Americans. No, we're not going to pay for it. This is kind of what made the fair problematic and tricky. So, who's going to host? The logical choice is Washington, D.C. They're the capital. There's stuff to see there. It's relatively close to the coastline. Shouldn't be a big issue. The big issue comes in when D.C. finds out it's got to pay for it. Washington, D.C. is not very good at running itself and paying for stuff and managing money. They politely bowed out as soon as another city popped up. That other city was New York. In many respects, New York made even more sense than D.C. It was the largest city in America. It was one of two cities of over 1 million people. It was the main area where people came in from Europe, and that's where most of the World's Fair attendees would be coming from. It was also the center of culture and achievement in America. All modern happening stuff came through New York. However, New York was rather surprised and shocked that another city threw its hat in the ring, and that was Chicago. Chicago was America's second biggest city. It also was 1 million people, although smaller than New York. Now, just to put this in some context, because it really says a lot about Chicago, in the 1890 census, and that's the thing where they count people, it was most likely going to be, again, as it had been in the past, New York first, biggest city in America, over 1 million people. Second, Philadelphia in the eight or 900,000s. Third, Chicago. Shortly before the census took place in 1890, Chicago literally absorbed, they took over 10 communities that bordered it and declared them all to be part of the city of Chicago. It's like they invaded towns and took them over. When the counting was done, Chicago ended up as the second largest city in America, narrowly edging out Philadelphia, much to Philadelphia's not happiness. Chicago, oddly enough, was also the architectural leader of America. This one's kind of weird, but in the 1870s, there had been the Great Chicago Fire that had burned down most of downtown Chicago. Just as a bit of an aside, the exact same day, the exact same year, there was a bigger fire in Green Bay known as the Great Peshtigo Fire, still the highest death toll from a wildfire in American history. And if that isn't weird enough for you, the exact same day in the exact same year, there's another fire in northern Michigan that burned hundreds of thousands of acres. There's actually there's an interesting story involving a shrine in Green Bay um, about the story of the Great Peshtigo Fire and a whole religious sort of prophecy context to it. But it's interesting that all three of these fires happen at the same time. Now, the other interesting part about the Chicago fire, which we'll talk about, is the story behind it. Third thing, but in any case, the fire had destroyed downtown Chicago, And architects began moving to Chicago to build the city over again and to show off what the newest style and thinking in architecture was. Now, Chicago also was the railroad hub of the United States. Yes, New York was certainly where boats from Europe would come, but seriously, dude, you get on a train from New York and in like 5 days you're in Chicago. It's not that big of a deal. Furthermore, if you're coming from the West Coast, like if you're Asian visitors or if you're from the Western states, you got to go through Chicago anyways. It's closer. So the real issue is going to come down to the battle for the fair is a battle between the two cities. First of all, there's the actual prestige of the cities. New York City felt at the time and still feels now that it's the center of the universe. Everything in New York matters before anything else. Chicago, on the other hand, is sort of like somebody who keeps coming in second and wants to prove that they're just as good as the first place guy. There's a lot of negative views of Chicago, which we'll talk about in a moment, but Chicago had a lot to show off. One of the things is how Chicago had rebuilt itself after the Great Fire. So early on, Chicago it was a huge city, but it was a city made of wooden buildings that were only 5 or 6 feet apart from each other. The fire, once it caught, just jumped from one building to the next and literally burned everything down. So the story goes that one cold October night, Mrs. O'Leary, Irish immigrant, went out to her barn to milk her cow. The cow apparently did not appreciate Mrs. O'Leary's cold hands and kicked, knocking over a lantern, starting the barn on fire, and thus resulted the Great Chicago Fire. The result of the cow, but more significantly, the result of an Irish woman's cow. Why is this important? Because of racial hatred. Now, this is going to surprise a lot of people, but in the 1870s and 80s in Chicago, you had an easier time getting a job if you were Black or Asian than if you were Irish. There were signs that said, no Irish need apply. The Irish were truly the outcasts of Chicago. They were loathed and despised. They were considered to be different and not really quite sure where a lot of the hatred came from. Chicago doesn't really have a big English population, like English, but the Great Chicago Fire in its story really just was a shot at Irish immigrants and the Irish in general. Now, in addition to this battle between the cities for prestige, it's also a battle between the millionaires of the cities. In New York, J.P. Morgan, the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt and the grandson of John Jacob Astor, America's first millionaire, put up $15 million for New York City. In today's money, that's around $600 million. Not to be outdone, the Yerkes family in Chicago, who owned Chicago's streetcar systems, that's the public transportation of the time. The Armour and Swift families, who owned Chicago's meatpacking industries, which, by the way, Chicago's real money did not come from railroads, it came from meatpacking. That's where its fortunes were made. And Marshall Field, owner of the first nationwide chain department store, Marshall Field and Company, now known as Marshall's, all ponied up $15 million for Chicago. The real issue for Congress comes down to the fact that when Congress needed some pushing about who to choose, Chicago came up with another $5 million in the space of 24 hours to back up its claim, giving Chicago the right to host the fair. New York was not happy about this, and New York wanted Chicago to fail. And there's some good reasons to believe here that Chicago would be an abject failure, which is what we'll talk about in our next lesson, which will be coming up. Okay, peace and love.